Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for joining today. We'll get started in just a few minutes to let everybody trickle in. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for joining today. My name is Vanessa, and I am a specialist here at Statistics Solutions. And today for our webinar, we are going to be talking about confidently presenting your quantitative results chapter. So this webinar will be helpful to doctoral students who are in the process of writing up or analyzing the results for their quantitative studies. We also have a number of resources available to students who are interested in conducting qualitative research or mixed methods research, but the primary focus of today's presentation will be quantitative methods. You'll notice in the chat, there are a few links and resources that may be helpful to you all as you are working on your papers. We do have a number of webinars throughout the month related to all of the different chapters of the dissertation. We also have a number of free resources, including blog posts, templates, and different tools. So do check us out on the website and see if there's anything that may be helpful to you. And if you're looking for something, let us know and we can try to point you in the direction towards different resources based on your needs. As we get started today, go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat. Let me know where you are in your dissertation process. That'll help as we kind of go through the presentation to ensure that I'm covering information that is most helpful for you all. At the end of the presentation today, I will open it up for question and answer. So if you have questions, you can be putting those in the chat throughout. And I'll make sure to leave some time at the end to answer those. We'll also put our contact information. So if you want to reach out to us one-on-one, we can do that as well. I see we have a hand raised. Cheryl, did you have a question? All right, well, if you end up having a question, let me know. So we will go ahead and get started here. So just a little information about Statistics Solutions. We are a full service dissertation and editing consulting company. So we help students with all different chapters in the dissertation, from developing your research questions, developing your topic, writing your introduction, your literature search, your methodology, analyzing and writing up your results, and writing the discussion. We also assist students with preparing PowerPoint presentations for their proposal or for the defense, the final defense. So basically, it's kind of a one-stop shop, all service type of situation. So if you think that you might benefit from some of those services, again, just let us know. We do offer a free 30-minute consultation that is available from Mondays through Fridays from 9 to 5, where we just kind of talk to you about your research needs and identify if there's a specialist on staff that can help you with your particular needs, whether it's specifically related to a content expertise or a specific methodology, or if it's a general research need like a literature search. So as I said, today we will be talking about the quantitative results chapter. So the typical components that you'll see in the quantitative chapter include the introduction, data collection and preparation, demographics and descriptive statistics, assumptions testing, analysis of the research questions and hypotheses, and then a summary. Now, this list is pretty comprehensive. From working with students, we've seen that these are the sections that most students are required to include in their dissertations. Now, it's important to note here that every school is different. So when you start writing any chapter in your dissertation, make sure that you are reaching out to your chair or your reviewers or past students to be sure that you know what is required of you. So if there's a template or a checklist that they can provide you with, that'll be a really good starting point to make sure you know what should be going in each section and also what section should be included. If you don't have a resource like that available to you, some other helpful places that you may look are ProQuest. That is a database of dissertations. So you can kind of look through a number of dissertations from different schools, different types of studies, and see how other people structured their papers. Another resource that may be helpful to you all is our dissertation template. So we do have a free dissertation template that students can use to guide the development of their papers. But for the purposes of today, I will be reviewing these components, and then again, I'll take questions at the end. So just a brief overview of the actual purpose of the results chapter. In this chapter, you're going to be presenting the data and the analysis that you've conducted to answer the research questions in your study. So here you're really thinking about the facts and figures for your quantitative study, any of your statistical tests, your summary statistics. Here's where you're going to be reporting that information. This differs slightly from the discussion chapter in that here you're not going to be going too deep into the interpretation of the results. Rather, you'll save your interpretation for the discussion section. So here, just kind of think about plainly reporting, what did you find? To begin this chapter, you will want to present the findings for each of your research questions. So you should be going through in a step-by-step process, and there should be an answer to every single research question that you have outlined at the beginning of your study. And then again, make sure that you are checking in with your program so that you know what the guidelines for your study and your school are. So to start off, you will provide an introduction. So the main objective of your introduction is to reorient the reader to your study and then to preview what you will be talking about in this chapter. So remember that by the time your reviewer has gotten to this chapter, they would have read chapters 1, 2, and 3, and it's most likely pretty lengthy. So here, you just want to remind them what the purpose of the study is, and also restate the research question and hypotheses so that as they are reading through this chapter, they have that base level understanding again of what it is they're looking for, what questions are being answered through the results that you're presenting in this chapter. Next, you will outline the contents that are going to be coming up. So you can do that by saying something like, in this chapter, the researcher will present the findings of the analysis. And you may even preview the different sections that you're going to be talking about. So those different bullet points that I had on the first component slide. So just kind of looking back, what is my study about? What do I want to do with this study? And then looking forward, here's what you can expect from me in this chapter. Next, you're going to talk about your data collection and preparation procedures. So at this point, if you are someone who has already proposed your study, you've passed your proposal, you had a clearly developed data collection and analysis plan in your proposal, when you get to this point in chapter 4, you're kind of just reporting back on those procedures. So did you maintain the same procedures? Did you deviate from that initial plan in any way? And if you did deviate from that plan, what were those deviations and why did they happen? So here you'll want to provide that kind of that report back of what it is that you did to collect and prepare the data for your study. So to do that, you should talk about your response rate and your attrition. So we want to know how many total responses did you receive for your study? Were there any exclusion procedures that you had to follow where you were getting rid of data or excluding participants? And if you were excluding participants, we want to make sure to document the reasons that they were excluded and also how many were excluded. This information is going to lead into your total final sample. So I'll provide some examples of what that looks like in the next few slides here. And then if you are not able to reach your target sample size, you'll also want to mention any type of post hoc power analysis that you may have conducted to mitigate that sample size challenge that you may have had in your study. You're also going to talk about any data preparation steps that you took. So any way that you manipulated the data to prepare it to be analyzed for those main statistical tests or main outcome analysis that is outlined for your study, you'll want to talk about that as well. So for example, let's say you're conducting a study of postpartum depression and life satisfaction. Maybe those are the two variables that you would like to review associations between. If you are collecting postpartum depression, you may be using a multiple item scale like the patient health questionnaire, which I believe requires you to take a sum of the responses, and then the sum based on that questionnaire is your depression score. So one step that you may need to take in order to prepare for your main outcome analysis is to create a sum variable in your data set. So that's the type of preparation that I'm talking about. Any type of recoding or reverse coding where you're having to change that data or compute new scores, you'll want to describe that process so the reader understands how you went from the data that you collected to your final analysis stage. You'll also want to talk about how you're ensuring that the data is accurate. So if you are someone who administered a survey via an online link, or maybe if you've done this before, you know it is not uncommon for people to enter information incorrectly in the survey. So you may have someone writing they are 134 years old, maybe it's a typo. You may have someone saying they were 20 months pregnant. So these different errors that we see sometimes. You'll want to outline here what procedures you're going through to review your data and clean it so that you're making sure not to have this data that kind of doesn't make sense, that may negatively impact or may have an impact on the ultimate findings of your results. So here you'll talk about those data cleaning procedures as well. If you have any missing data, which again is not uncommon, you will also want to talk about how you're handling that missing data. So you have a few options and decisions available to you when it comes to missing data. You can completely exclude individuals who didn't complete the data collection. You can exclude individuals who didn't complete a portion of the data collection, or maybe your variables of interest. So that is really up to you, and we'll go through some examples of what that looks like as well. If you're doing a study where you're not collecting your own data, so if you're doing something where you are maybe accessing a publicly available data set, then in this step, you're still going to talk about your data cleaning and still talk about how you excluded people, but it'll just be a little bit different. Rather than discussing the inclusion criteria that you use to recruit participants, you'll discuss the inclusion criteria that you applied to the particular data set that was already existing. So I'm going to go through a number of results examples, and you will all receive copies of these slides. So if you'd like to look back for ideas on how you might write up your own work, these may be helpful. So in this example, this person is explaining to us how they reached their total final sample. So here we see that they collected 485 surveys and that they excluded participants who did not answer more than 50 of the questions that were pertaining to the study variables. So if my main outcome was postpartum depression and there was a participant who answered maybe only one of the postpartum depression questions out of 10, I would exclude that person based on this particular procedure here. So those people were removed, and that resulted in a total final sample of 396 participants included in the analysis. So here, again, just providing a really crisp and clear explanation of kind of that chain of participants. How did you start? What data did you collect? And then who was ultimately moved forward for the analysis for your study. Here is another example. So here, this one is a little more detailed. So here they're specifying when the data collection took place. So this person collected data from May 26, 2017 to June 18th, 2017. They indicated how many people accessed the survey in that time period. So we had 163 participants. Then they began to go through some of the exclusion criteria. So there were 3 participants who did not agree to the informed consent, so they were excluded. There was another 59 participants who left more than 10% of the survey answers or survey questions unanswered, so they were also excluded. Then, relating to the specific inclusion criteria for the study, there were 3 participants who did not have the relevant work experience of being a nurse for this study, so they were also excluded. After all of these participants were excluded, we ended up with a final total sample of 98 that were included in the data analysis. So again, just another example of how you might explain this to your reader. Now, in this example, we're discussing the results of a post hoc power analysis. So again, if you did not achieve your intended sample size and you want to kind of speak to whether or not your study is sufficiently powered, you might conduct a post hoc power analysis. And this is what that would look like as well. Once you've talked about your data cleaning procedures, you will begin to talk about the people that participated in your study and also the variables of interest. So here you're going to first characterize your variables of interest. So for each of the main variables for your study, you'll want to provide some descriptive statistics. Just a little refresher on your stats courses. If you have a variable that is categorical, you will be reporting the frequencies and percentages. So you might be saying 30% were female, or you may say 45% were Hispanic or Latino. If you are presenting continuous variables like age, weight, things like this, then you would be reporting means and standard deviation. So you might say the average age was 25. So just kind of a little refresher on stats. You will want to go through this process for each of your variables of interest. So in my example where I'm studying the postpartum depression in a sample, I will want to explain in the people who I collected what was the average postpartum depression score, or what was the distribution of postpartum depression in that sample. And again, this is going to, everything that you do here is going to provide the context to understand the results that you found. So for example, if I have a sample that is expressing high levels of depression, that's going to have implications for the rest of the variables that I'm studying. And just to kind of bring this into a real world example, I recently did a study. It was a secondary data analysis of women who do or do not have access to maternity leave and the implications of that. And in this sample, about 80% of the women were of a high socioeconomic status. So that's just an example of important information for the reader to understand before they interpret my results. Because if I'm saying everybody had access to, or rather, if I'm saying nobody took paid maternity leave, and then we take a step back and say, okay, well, it looks like all of the women included in the study were of high socioeconomic status, the conclusion may be different. So if I tell you no one took paid maternity leave without providing that background context, you might think that's because it wasn't available to them, or because maybe they had a support at home. But having this extra context, we might come to a different conclusion and say, well, paid maternity leave may not be needed in this population or in this sample. So again, just important here to provide that context for the next steps. Next, you will talk about the demographic characteristics in your sample as they are related to your population. So remember here that the population for your study is the large group of people that you were hoping to draw inferences or hoping to make inferences about. And then the sample are the people that are actually included in the study. So if I wanted to conduct a study of people who gave birth in the United States, my population would be people who give birth in the United States, and then my sample would be the actual women who gave birth in the United States that I was able to survey and include in my analysis. So the importance of providing some demographic characteristics comparing these two is that you are kind of providing that groundwork for whether or not this study is going to be generalizable to the population. So in the example that I gave earlier, where I had this group that was of very high socioeconomic status, we might conclude that that sample is not necessarily generalizable because they don't reflect the overall distribution of socioeconomic status in the population. And then in addition to describing your variables and your sample and population, you'll also want to describe the reliability coefficients of any measures that you're using. So if you are using a particular instrument, so for the study that I mentioned, the patient health questionnaire, then you need to explain or provide justification for why this instrument is appropriate to use in this study. And that, again, is just ensuring that you are testing what you're supposed to be testing. And a lot of that work, I would say that last bullet there, would have been done in your chapter 3 when you were exploring what instruments you would use to collect your data. So here we have a few examples. So this is an example of how you might convey the demographic characteristics of your sample. Tables are a great tool. I recommend putting this in a table whenever possible, and also having a narrative description that is capturing the highlights or the summary information about your table. So here we see that they're giving us the high points. So the majority of participants were men. There was 255 men. That's about 64.4% of the sample. And they're giving us the most observed age as well. So most of these men were between the ages of, or most of the participants were between the ages of 30 to 44. So you'll see here that these are all categorical variables. Each of these variables is falling into a different category, and that's why we're presenting frequencies and percents. Earlier, I mentioned that age is a continuous variable. This is an example of how you may present age as a categorical variable. So if you just have those cutoff points, then you can present it this way. Here, this person is also showing us how many people were missing from that particular question. So we can understand from this that 6 people did not answer the gender question and 6 people did not answer the age question. So now another example. In this case, we are summarizing the continuous variables in the study. So we have our minimum, maximum, mean, and standard deviation. And in this case, they're summarizing age, time, and nurse to patient ratio. One way that you can make this a more rigorous visualization is just to have that brief description above the table, giving you those highlights. So saying the average age among participants was 48.2. They had a maximum of 50 years working as a mental health nurse, and the maximum nurse to patient ratio was 400. So you may want to just provide those high points. Here's an example of how you might express these reliability coefficients for your scale. So in this case, they are using this SCS scale, and they're providing each of the subscales. And through that, they're telling us the number of items that were in the scale and also the Cronbach's alpha for the scale. So once you've done this, you will move on to the assumptions testing. So for a number of statistical tests, there are some assumptions that need to be met in order to go forward with that test. For example, if you're doing a t-test, 2 assumptions that should be met are normality and homogeneity of variance. So in this step, you are going to explain what assumptions were needed to be tested in order to move forward with your final analysis. So you're going to explain how you tested the assumption. So for example, if you're testing normality, you might use a histogram. You might look at a QQ plot. You might look at the skewness or kurtosis of that particular variable. So you have a few options on how you do these things. Here you'll just explain what did you do and just indicate that it's the appropriate strategy to test that assumption. Next, you will talk about what the results of the assumption were, and I'll share some examples of what that looks like. And then you will talk about whether or not the assumption was met and kind of what the decision is based on that assumptions test. So for example, if you're doing a parametric test and then your normality assumption isn't met, what is your next step going to be? Are you going to pivot and do a non-parametric test? Are you going to manipulate your data to make it conform to these assumptions? It's very, very specific and dependent on your study. But the purpose here, again, is to just justify these choices you're making and really explain and use previous literature to provide rationale for why it makes sense for you to make the decisions that you are. Just a note here, some schools will ask you to present these assumptions tests alongside your results, whereas others may request this in a separate section. So just a reminder to check in with your schools. So here we have an example of someone who's doing a test of normality. Earlier I said QQ plot, but I meant PD plot, my apologies. So in this case, they are looking at a PP plot to determine whether or not the data is normal. And they are concluding that because the data pretty well follows the normal curve, there's no significant deviations, that the assumption of normality is met. So this is one way that you might present this information in your paper. Now, in this example, we are looking at outliers in order to determine whether or not multicollinearity was severe. So in this case, we see that they're using the VIF values to provide this information. And through their analysis, they found that there was one observation. So there was one outlier that was exceeding kind of a normal standard deviation from the mean for this particular study. So this researcher chose to exclude this one outlier from the analysis, and that was what they needed to do in order to ensure that their data met those assumptions. So this is another option. You may need to manipulate data if it's not going to skew what you have too much. It may be an option to just exclude in some cases. So once you have completed your assumptions testing, the next step, and this is really the meat of it, it's kind of everything that we've talked about is just the lead up to this, is to present your results. So the results should be presented by research question or hypotheses. Again, we want to make sure there is a clear result and a clear answer to each of the research questions. Here, you are going to first note any changes from your originally planned data analysis plan. So if in chapter 3, you said you were going to do a t-test, and then when it came time to analyze your data, you tested your assumptions and you were not able to do a t-test because your data didn't meet those assumptions. Here, you'll just report back on, or not report back, but you'll kind of now give an update on what you did given that assumptions testing or given any deviations to that plan. And I think it's important to note here that this is okay. When we propose our research for the first time, it's with kind of this ideal bubble in mind, right? We're proposing what we hope might happen, but it's not uncommon that things may not go as planned, or data just doesn't always conform to what we think it's going to. So if you're someone that is having to change your data analysis plan later in the game, that's okay. The key to this is really just providing clear justifications for why you made the changes and why they are rigorous and sufficient to answer your research questions. So once you have noted any changes, if that's applicable to you, you're going to identify the variables that were used, including the independent variable, dependent variables, any predictors, criterions, or covariate variables that were used in that model or in that analysis. Next, you're going to report any relevant or appropriate statistics that are associated with the test that you used. So for example, if you're doing a t-test, you should be reporting a test statistic, the t-value. If you are doing an ANOVA test, the statistic that is associated with that test is the F statistic. F is in Frank. If you're doing a chi-squared test, you're going to be reporting X. So just be aware of these different key features of the test that you're using. We do have some resources to help out with that on our website. So if you have questions, let us know. But that's what you'll do next. You'll report those relevant statistics. One tip, whenever I am writing, I Google APA format, and then I put in the type of test that I'm doing. And that is a really easy way to just make sure you're including everything that you should be including in terms of numerical values for that test. And then, as we spoke about earlier, here you may also report the results of your post hoc testing if you conducted a post hoc test. And then this is like the reason that you did this study. The next step is to indicate whether or not your hypotheses, whether or not you rejected or failed to reject your null hypotheses. So you want to make sure that you have a very clear statement to that effect so that the researcher or the reader knows whether or not your hypotheses were supported in the data. So you'll follow each of these steps for each of the research questions. I don't recommend mixing and mingling. Really, I think that keeping them separate provides a really clear and concise product for whoever's reading it. So when possible, keep these separate, follow each of the steps in this clear step-by-step fashion, and you'll be in good shape. So now we will go through some examples. Here, this person conducted an independent samples t-test, and they did this to determine if there were differences in this SAI scale based on gender. So our independent variable in this case is gender, and the dependent variable is the total score on the scale. Here they're telling us that the results of the t-test were not significant, and we see that they're reporting the degrees of freedom for the t-test, so that's 105 here. They're reporting the actual t-statistic, 1.96, the p-value, 0.52, and they're also giving us the effect size. So based on these results, they concluded that there were no differences in score based on gender. And then again, that clear statement about the null hypothesis was not rejected. Remember, when we failed to reject the null hypothesis, that means that there were no significant results. And then to accompany that, they're just providing us with those relevant statistics. So because this is a t-test and we're comparing means, they're giving us the means and the standard deviations. So now we can look at this table, and based on the findings of the test, we can understand that although females had a mean score of 4.08 and males had a mean score of 3.60, these were not statistically significant differences. This is not what we would expect or what we wouldn't expect given to chance. And we can interpret that based on what we've been given here in the paragraph. Now in the next example, they conducted an independent samples t-test. In this case, we have the same dependent variable, so it's that SAI score, and our independent variable has been swapped out. So now we're looking at school level, and the two levels we're talking about are elementary school and a combination of middle school or high school. Here again, we're reporting our relevant statistics, so the degrees of freedom, test statistic, p-value, effect size. And in this case, our p-value we can see here is very small, 0.002. So this researcher is concluding that there were differences based on the school level. And because of that, they can say that their null hypothesis was rejected. So we have here our relevant statistics. So now we can see, yes, these were numerically different, and we can also conclude that they are statistically significantly different. This is an example of a one-way ANOVA. So in the one-way ANOVA, we're looking at multiple groups. In this case, they were looking at the SAI score based on, let's see here, the years of experience. So here, our independent variable was years of experience. Our dependent variable remains the same. You'll notice here that the reporting of this information looks slightly different. So for the ANOVA, we're providing the F statistic, F as in Frank, and we're providing 2 degrees of freedom instead of 1 as we did with the t-test. So just a few things to be aware of. Just make sure you're checking in with the type of test that you're doing. We've got our p-value here, 0.555. This p-value is quite large. So based on this study, or based on these results, rather, we're concluding that there's no difference based on years of teaching experience. If there's no difference, that means that we are not rejecting the null hypothesis. We are not finding significance here. And that is the conclusion of this result. Again, providing the relevant statistics so that the reader can see what this looks like for themselves. And in this case, when you have an ANOVA test, there may be some instances where you're going to go into a post hoc test. So if we found that this was significant, that would indicate to us that there is a difference, but it wouldn't tell us where the difference lies. We wouldn't know if individuals from 0 to 4 were statistically different from 15 to 19 or 5 to 9, we would just know that there's a difference somewhere. So the next step would be a post hoc test to determine where the difference lies. So if you're doing a test like this, just be aware that it doesn't end here. If you find significance, there is a next step to further provide information on your results. Okay, so then this example is a correlation. So here we want to know what the relationship is between positive attributes of self-compassion and perceived level of caring efficacy for these nurses. So to do that, we're conducting a Pearson's correlation. Clearly see here that they are explaining what test they're using and why they're using it to identify the relationships between these two variables. And then they're going on to provide the relevant statistics. So in this case, we're giving Pearson's R and the p-value for each of the variables. So we have self-kindness, common humanity, mindfulness, and then our larger scale. Here they concluded that these were positively correlated with caring efficacy. So that in this case means that those who were scoring higher in positive attributes of self-compassion also were scoring higher in perceived level of caring efficacy. Because we found that there was a correlation, we are rejecting the null hypothesis. So take a look here at these p-values, 0.005, 0.002, 0.001, 0.006. That is the indicator that we had significance here in this test. And then they're just providing their correlations based on the different attributes or variables that were included in this analysis. Also important here, you'll notice in each of the tables, we're also providing the sample size. So we want to know how many people were included in that particular test as well. All right, in this next example, we are presenting the findings of a regression. So this regression was to understand if these predictors, so age, sex, income, race, slow onset experience, rapid onset experience, exercise-induced experience, family support, and self-efficacy, were significant predictors of the behavior scores. So in this case, let's take a look at our significance level. So this is our P column. We see that there's one value that is significant at a level of 0.05. So this is less than 0.05. So for that reason, they concluded that sex was a significant positive predictor. And they're providing the relevant information here. So they have their parameter estimate and they have their p-value. And they're also providing just a basic statement on what this means in the real world. So what do these numbers mean? This means that females tended to have a higher prevention behavior score than the males. So once you have done all of that, you have presented your facts and figures. The next step is to summarize the findings. So you'll want to provide a chapter summary, really capturing those high points of your results that you plan to expand further on in your discussion. So you're going to have to talk about everything in your discussion, of course, but here you may want to call out specific results that are maybe more relevant to the current literature, or maybe if you found a novel finding, you may want to highlight those a little bit more to build the foundation to really expand on what this means for your field or what this means in the context of your study in the discussion section. So again, you will restate the answers to the research questions. So those basic statements about whether or not you accepted or you rejected or failed to reject the null hypothesis. And then you'll just transition into the discussion chapter. So you might say, in the following chapter, the interpretation of these results will be presented, something like that. But that does bring me to the end of the slides for today. So I will open it up for questions. If you have questions or if you'd like to be pointed to any particular resources, let us know. We'll stick around here and answer questions for a while. If you do not have questions, thank you all so much for being here today and for joining. I wish you guys the best of luck as you're working on your dissertations. And don't hesitate to reach out if you have questions. All right, so let me just scroll through the chat to see if I've missed any questions yet. Thank you guys, thank you for joining. Okay, I do see one question. So currently developing my dissertation proposal. I plan to conduct secondary research analysis. Are there specific differences in presenting quantitative results for secondary analysis versus for primary data collection? Let's see. Let me go back to my components list. Off the top of my head, I would say no, but let's go back here to not this slide, this one. I think the only place where you may differ is in this data collection and preparation phase, because since you did not collect the data, rather than explaining maybe how you reached out to participants or anything like that, in your chapter 3, you'll explain the process that you went through to obtain access to the data. So it could be that you had to, let's say you were conducting, let's say that you were collecting data from NHANES, which is a national survey that the CDC gives. Actually, that's a bad example. The PRAMS, that's a national survey that the CDC gives. In order to gain access to the PRAMS, you need to submit a request for the data. So you may describe that process as opposed to actually going out there and recruiting participants. That would be a difference in chapter 3. In terms of chapter 4, if the data set that you have has been manipulated in any way, you may want to explain what those manipulations were. So sometimes with these large state data sets, they'll compute variables already, or they'll do different things to obscure the data. So you might just be speaking to what's in the data manual. So I would say no differences. You're still going to follow the same process, but you'll be reporting back on what someone else did, as opposed to necessarily saying what you did in some cases. So I would just make sure you print out or have a PDF copy of that manual from the researchers, so you really understand what's built into that data set. One really good example is survey weights. If there's survey weights in there, you may need to take that into consideration when you are doing your analysis, whether or not you want to include them. And if you include them, you will really need to refer back to the data manual to understand how to incorporate them into your analysis. I hope that helps. Okay, let's see. Okay, April is asking about reliability. So in this phase, the reliability will be related to the data that you've collected. So especially I think if you've developed your own instrument, we want to see, based on the responses in this sample, were these particular questions reliable to answer what you were trying to get them to answer. So it will be based on the actual data that you have in your data set. But at the same time, if you're using an instrument that's been used before, like a self-efficacy scale, or some of those more commonly used instruments, they will also have information about the reliability of those instruments in papers that have been published using them before. So you may also want to refer to those to give you an idea of how this is performing in your sample. But essentially, that's giving you the pointer. When you're looking for instruments to use, it's telling you if it's reliable. Okay, this is a good tool to understand the particular variable of interest. Would those values be the same as sensitivity and reliability? I've not developed my own instrument. So yes, this is the same as reliability. And sensitivity, right? Because we're trying to understand, is it capturing everything that it needs to capture? So yeah, I would say yes. You're welcome. Are you in a public health program by chance? Clinical neuro. I knew it. Any other questions? Thank you. Let us know if there's anything we can help with. So you will all receive a copy of both the slides and the recordings, but there's also a webinar archive library that Sierra has posted the link to, and that's where we house all of the webinar recordings. So if you need help later down the road with writing your discussion, we have a webinar dedicated to discussion. Same with different types of statistical analysis. So that may be a helpful tool. All right, well, if there's no more questions, I hope you all have a great rest of your day. And thank you again for joining today.